Hello, this is Eye on Africa. I'm Yena Lee, and these are your headlines on the continent tonight. Lawmakers in Namibia debate over whether to accept a genocide compensation deal from Germany. Berlin has offered to fund 1.1 billion euros worth of projects over a century after colonial forces massacred an estimated 75,000 people. Uganda heads towards a lighter lockdown. Universities are to welcome students, funerals and weddings are to resume. Meanwhile, President Yoweri Museveni sets the vaccination goal to 10% of the population by the end of the year. And films are back on the big screen in Somalia. The National Theatre in Mogadishu hosts its first public screening in 3 decades, much to the delight of filmmakers and fans. But first, can $1.1 billion worth of projects atone for a genocide? That's the question Namibian lawmakers are debating in Parliament. Germany offered the landmark deal to compensate for a 4-year-long genocide that started in 1904. Colonial forces violently repressed an uprising and wiped out 80% of Over-Herero population and 50% of the Nama people. Opposition parties and traditional leaders have criticised the agreement. Valerie de Kemp has the story.
The billion-euro deal has sparked heated discussions in Namibia's parliament over how a former colonial power should make amends. The country should receive 1.1 billion euros in funding as part of a compensation offer from Germany for its role in the massacre of tribal communities in the early 1900s. An agreement that has divided lawmakers.
We are rejecting the agreement or the declaration because it doesn't speak to the needs of the affected communities.
Known as the Forgotten Genocide, an estimated 75,000 Herero and Nama people were executed under German colonial rule between 1904 and 1908 in what is now Namibia. Last May, and after years of negotiations, the former colonial power officially acknowledged the genocide, promising to fund reconstruction projects over the next 30 years. But for the victims' descendants, that's not enough, arguing the families should be granted reparations. Some activists are calling for at least 9 billion euros in compensation for the atrocities.
Vir die afgelope 31 jaar het die SWAPO regering meer as 1.1 biljoen Duitse mark van die Duitse regering gekry. Wil hulle ons dieselfde bedrag betaal vir die skuld wat hulle sê hulle het?
On Tuesday, hundreds of people gathered outside Parliament to protest against the agreement. The government, meanwhile, has defended the deal, saying the objective was to get the former colonial power to acknowledge its responsibility in the genocide.
In Tunisia, 4 political parties said that President Kais Saied has lost his legitimacy. The Speaker of the Parliament also called for a peaceful struggle against a one-man rule, this in an interview to AFP. The Tunisian president has been facing mounting pressure from critics who say he's taking over power in what amounts to a coup. On Wednesday, Saied announced that he'd rule by decree and is ready to change Tunisia's political system. In July, he dismissed the government and the parliament. Next to Uganda, where university students are gearing up to return to campuses, President Museveni partially lifted COVID restrictions and said that they can go back to in-person classes on November 1st. However, primary schools remain closed until next January, by when authorities hope that 10% of the population will have been vaccinated. From Kampala, here's our correspondent Michael O'Hagan.
Places of worship will be fully open. Up to 200 people will be able to congregate to pray together, and that also affects weddings and funerals. However, some of those rules were, although on paper they were very strict, they were widely flouted. So, for example, one middle-class Ugandan told me recently that at their grandmother's recent funeral, many hundreds of poor villagers attended the funeral in the hope that they could get just a single plate of food from the family, because they'd been so impoverished by the pandemic. And that's really been a story of Uganda's experience during COVID-19, the difference between rich and poor. There's an ongoing dusk to dawn curfew, but in the capital, Kampala, high-end cars are seen on the road late into the night, while poor city dwellers who can't afford a car are confined to the slums.
And just briefly, Michael, how is the vaccination rollout going over there? And is the president's goal realistic?
The vaccination rollout is going very slowly. There have been 2 million shots administered, but of those, only 400,000 people have received the second shot, the full shot, full vaccination. To reach the 10% goal, which would be 4.8 million vulnerable and frontline workers, will be a big stretch. And schools, primary and secondary schools, have been closed, and it's likely to remain that way until certainly till January 2022, and perhaps for some considerable time longer. And of course, poor Ugandan children haven't had the opportunity to have online learning or any kind of private tutorials during this lockdown.
Time now for a quick look at other news stories on our radar tonight. In Mozambique, a multinational task force has rescued 87 women and children from a jihadist base in Cabo Delgado. Insurgents have been particularly active in the gas-rich region in the northeast since 2017. It's also where militants overran the city of Palma back in March, and some 30,000 people were displaced in the violence. A UN report says that South Sudan's elite is looting public money. More than $73 million has disappeared since 2018, and over half of that in a period of just 2 months. Authors highlighted that the oil industry is a major source of plundering and added that their estimate is just a fraction of what's been going on. And Kenyan authorities have banned a documentary about a gay couple. The Kenya Film Classification Board said that I Am Samuel was blasphemous and banned it in the country. The documentary follows the story of 2 men living in Nairobi for over 5 years. Director Peter Murimi contrasts banal scenes of love with violent scenes of persecution. Let's head to Somalia now for a cultural and social milestone, the National Theatre's first film screening in 3 decades. The institution had witnessed repeated scenes of violence in the past. Warlords fought over the building in the late 90s. Islamist militants overran it in 2006. An al-Shabaab suicide bomber attacked it in 2011. Now Mogadishu residents are hoping to put this dark chapter behind them and enjoy creations on the big screen.
This is the first Somali movie that's ever going to be on the National Somalias Theatre since 1987. And even before 1987, there was like live shows, and plays and stuff like that. But for them to allow this is such a big deal. This is good for every Somali filmmaker, every Somali producer.
We used to watch films, but that time was over when the civil war broke out and people fled the city. I haven't seen a film in the last 30 years, so I would like cinemas to reopen. I'd like to watch movies again.
And finally, our last report is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You might remember that last May, a volcano erupted near the eastern city of Goma. Mount Nyiragongo's spewings left more than 30 people dead and destroyed many buildings. Goma's roller skating champion, Serge Makolo, actually lost his home and most of his equipment back then. Despite his losses, he's still just as passionate for the sport and is trying to share it with others. Nicolas Germain has this.
Serge Makolo's house used to stand here. That was before the eruption of the Nyiragongo volcano last May. It killed more than 30 people and destroyed 3,000 homes. Makolo is 24 years old and he's Goma's roller speed skating champion.
This eruption really hurt me. I lost a lot of equipment. Some of it belonged to teenagers that I train, junior skaters who will replace us one day.
5 mornings a week, Makolo teaches roller skating to dozens of young men and women. They are preparing for next year's Francophone Games, which are taking place in Congo's capital, Kinshasa.
There have been many problems in eastern Congo, wars, and the eruption of the volcano. Skating comforts us. When we skate, we, the young people, forget all of the bad things.
This sport is their passion, but they also have high ambitions. Roller speed skating appeared in the 2018 Youth Olympic Games, and Makolo hopes it will soon become a full Olympic sport so that he can add another medal to his vast collection.
That's it for our Eye on Africa. Tonight's show was produced by Anna Kowalska and her team behind the cameras.
Hidden in plain sight, mountains of rubbish that have travelled far. Poland is Europe's favourite destination for disposing of waste cheaply. Giant dump sites which conveniently catch fire. An illegal trade as lucrative as narcotics, while the environment pays the price.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.